Paul's letter to the Romans, it's one of the longest and most significant things that this man ever wrote. As you may remember, Paul, he was formerly known as Saul of Tarsus. He was a Jewish rabbi. He belonged to this group known as the Pharisees. And he was super passionate and devout to the Jewish Torah of Moses and to the Jewish practices and traditions of his people. And from his point of view, Jesus and his whole movement and followers were a threat to the stability and security, safety of God's people. And so he later had a radical encounter with the risen Jesus himself, and he became one of his followers, surprisingly. And so his name was changed to Paul, and he was even commissioned as an apostle, like an official representative of Jesus. So Paul, he went about as a missionary, telling people about Jesus all over the ancient Roman world. And people would become followers of Jesus and form into these Jesus communities, or churches, as he called them. And as time went on, he would write letters to these churches to help foster their faith or address problems that were coming up or to answer their questions and so on. The letter to the Romans is one of these. We also know from the book of Acts, you should check out Acts chapter 18, verses 1 and 2. We know that the church in Rome consisted of both Jewish Christians, followers of Jesus, but also non-Jewish or Gentile Christians. And a number of years before Paul wrote this letter, the Roman emperor, a guy named Claudius, he had all the Jewish people expelled and run out of Rome for about 5 years until he died. And so 5 years later, then all those Jews, including Christian Jews, were allowed to come back to Rome and return. But when they did, they came back to their church community and realized it had become very non-Jewish in their customs and practices, the way they talked. And so you can imagine there's all these tensions that arise. So should non-Jewish followers of Jesus celebrate the Sabbath? Should they eat according to the Jewish kosher dietary laws? Should they be circumcised? And so on. So he says right at the beginning and at the end of the letter, he wants this church to become unified as one whole family of people in Jesus. And for a clear reason. He wants this church to become a staging ground so that they can send him as a missionary to go even further west, past Rome, all the way to Spain. And the letter, it's long and it has one long connected flow of thought, but it's broken up into 4 really clear kind of movements of thought. So in the first main movement, in chapters 1 through 4, Paul makes some foundational points that he's going to develop throughout the whole rest of the letter. In chapter 1, he starts telling a story about the non-Jewish world, the Gentiles, and he says that all humanity has become trapped in this spiral of sin and selfishness. He argues that the human heart and mind has turned inward on itself because of idolatry, which is giving ultimate allegiance and devotion to created things that are not the one true God. And it results, Paul says, in this distortion of our humanity. And so he concludes that all nations are in need of God's grace and God's mercy. It's chapter 1. In chapter 2, he says the Jewish people might respond and say, well, good thing for us. We've been shown God's grace and mercy. He rescued us out of Egypt. He showed us how to become true humans by giving us the Torah at Mount Sinai. He gave us these practices about Sabbath and eating kosher and circumcision. But Paul stops and he says, no, not so fast. He says the people of Israel, if you read the story of the scriptures, they've proven themselves to be just as bad and corrupt as the rest of the human race through hypocrisy and rebellion. And so even the Jewish people themselves, his own people, are just as broken and sinful as the rest of humanity. And so he draws his conclusion in chapter 3. He says that all humanity, it doesn't matter whether you're Jew or Gentile, all humanity is trapped in the brokenness of sin and rebellion and selfishness. And so the resolution to this huge human mess, it comes to its high point right here at the end of chapter 3 in this crucial paragraph, and it's very dense. Paul unpacks the significance of Jesus, his death, his resurrection, and the good news. He says that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, whose death on the cross was a sacrifice, where he took into himself all of the pain and the sin and the results of all humanity's evil, so that through him, all sin could be put to death, paid for, dealt with once and for all. And it's by trusting in Jesus' death and resurrection that was for us, that's how we find life and forgiveness, and we come into right relationship with God. It's what Paul calls God justifying sinners. And so he rounds off this first movement of thought by saying that God's purposes for all humanity have been fulfilled through Jesus, the Jewish Messiah. However, God's purpose was not that everyone has to become Jewish or obey the Torah and follow Jewish practices. Rather, God's goal, Paul says, was to create a huge family, a big multi-ethnic family of all kinds of different people who are saved by the Jewish Messiah and brought into a family that's in right relationship with God. Now, this was actually a really scandalous idea. You have a crucified Messiah remaking the family of God's people, including people from all nations. This is not a popular idea for other Jewish people in Paul's day. And so Paul, he makes super clear at the end of chapter 3, he says, listen, I'm not contradicting the scriptures of the Torah, but actually this new family around Jesus is what the story of the Torah is all about. And that's where he closes this first movement in chapter 4. He turns to the story of Abraham in the book of Genesis, and he says, before the Torah was ever given or there were any Jewish practices or anything, God promised Abraham that he would become the father of a whole family of nations, and that family would receive God's blessing, not by obeying the Torah or keeping the Sabbath or something like that, but just by being like Abraham, simply placing trust and faith in God's promises. And so Paul concludes that it's trust, it's faith in God's promises. That's what marks the family of God's covenant people. And so it's by trusting Jesus, the one in whom all God's promises have come true. So let's wrap up all of Paul's ideas here in the first movement of Romans. All humans need to be saved by God's grace. We're a hopeless mess. And that salvation comes through trusting in Jesus, the Messiah, his death and resurrection. We're not saved by obeying the Torah or following Jewish practices. And so through this, we learn that God's purpose was always to have this huge multi-ethnic family that keeps spreading and spreading throughout the whole world as the good news of Jesus travels further and further. Now, Paul's going to go on in the rest of the letter to develop how Jesus' death and resurrection made them not just a new family, but actually brand new humans who are empowered by God's Spirit. He's going to talk about how God still has a plan for his people of Israel and how this family, this multi-ethnic family, needs to learn how to live together in peace and forgiveness. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. All of that is rooted in these core ideas that we find in Romans chapters 1 through 4.